ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Today it's my conversation with lawyer and writer Chris Nyst. When a young Chris finished his law degree in the mid-1970s, he was advised not to work on the Gold Coast. According to the Brisbane legal fraternity, the Goldie was a place full of conveyances in shorts and long socks, not a place to make a serious career. But drawn by his love of surfing, Chris began his life in the law in what was then just a small holiday town on the beach. But his 45 years as a criminal lawyer have turned out to be a wild ride. He's acted for career criminals, corrupt police, heroin addicts, and the so-called postcard bandit, Brenden Abbott. Chris has used some of the more dramatic chapters in his working life as inspiration for his crime novels and for the film Getting Square. His recent novel, a murder mystery called Millen, reimagines one of the proudest moments of his legal career. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Sarah.
As a little boy, was being a lawyer what you dreamt of?
Well, strangely enough, it kind of was. I was a child of the 50s, which, of course, is the golden era of Hollywood. And my parents, like most people, I suppose, in those days, were movie mad. And we used to, I know that on a Friday and Saturday night, they'd dress us up in our pyjamas and dressing gowns and slippers, and they'd take us off to the local suburban picture theatre, and we'd sit in the canvas seats and watch.
In your PJs?
In our PJs, that's the way it was done. We were only little fellas, of course. We'd watch the likes of Gary Cooper and Spencer Tracy and Humphrey Bogart and all of those people. And so I, by the time I was about 10, I had convinced myself that I wanted to be an actor, just like all these heroes. But my father was smart enough to say to me, there's no money in the arts, when he was dead right there. So, what you need to be is a lawyer, because a lawyer's the next best thing to an actor. And, of course, in those days we had Raymond Burr in Perry Mason. I looked at that and I realised, well, my father was exactly right. And so that was the course I went on. And I pretty much continued on that trajectory right through until I got to finish my schooling and started university at the University of Queensland.
So your father was concerned, understandably, about you making a living, but was he also a man who admired eloquence, the ability of someone to change another person's mind through their words and their rhetoric?
Very much so. And in fact, my father eventually, many years later, became a lawyer himself, became a barrister and practised here at the Brisbane Bar for many years. But he could speak 5 languages. He was he was most impressed by the great orators of that time. And in the 60s and the 50s, many of the lawyers, particularly in the criminal law jurisdiction, were great orators. And my father was in particular a fan of the great Dan Casey, who was a very well-known and celebrated criminal law barrister at the time. And my father used to take us along to the courts, to the magistrates' courts usually, to see Casey cross-examining people and dressing
in
juries.
In your pyjamas and dressing gown to see that as well?
No, we got to wear our shorts and long socks.
So what, he'd just take you to go and look at law courts in session?
Yeah.
And what about, now a lot of public debate happens online or in social media, but back in the 50s and 60s, there was still the tradition of public speakers at the Domain. Was that a part of your life too?
We used to go to the Domain there near All Hallows and everybody get up on their soapbox and my father loved that, and he'd sort of insist, let's go along and watch, go to the Domain. Thankfully, he didn't sort of get onto the soapboxes, but he loved all of that.
Well, if he was going to take a spot on the soapbox, what kind of thing would have he argued about, do you think?
My father was a very original thinker, and he had an opinion on everything. He was a force of nature, my father, and so he'd talk to you about anything. In fact, in his dotage, I remember he wrote he began to write a sort of a little bit of a treatise on his big ideas. I called the book, I pre-called the book, the small book of big things because it was about everything, and he'd talk about the universe, and he'd talk about religion and all of these things, but he had some very strong original views.
Well, as a young kid, you were just hoping you wouldn't share those with the great public of Brisbane.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right.
Tell me about your dad's life growing up. What do you know about what things were like for him as a kid?
He had a very interesting and somewhat disrupted childhood. He was born in Marseille in south of France. His father was the Dutch consul in Marseille. His mother was Italian. And he was about 15 years of age when the Germans occupied south of France. So I think it was November 1942, the Germans, they had previously just occupied the north, but there was my father's family lived in what was called the zone libre, meaning the free zone in the south. But the Vichy government made some arrangements with the Germans, and they moved into the south of France. And at that time, everything changed for my father, and it's a long story, but he ended up having to leave his home and so forth.
Well, tell us about that, Chris. What happened? What was your grandfather doing that put the family in danger?
Well, my grandfather, as I said to you, is the Dutch consul in Marseille, and as such, he worked with a lot of expatriate Dutch people. And when the occupation occurred in, I think it was in early 1943, the French police rounded up about 13,000 Jews in Paris and put them in the velodrome there and then shipped them off to Germany, and that became part of a new initiative in terms of the Jews in France. And my grandfather came to realise that was going to be put in place in the south of France, and so he got it into his head that something had to be done about that, and he rented a series of old derelict farmhouses through the region around the Galabang, and it's a very hilly sort of area around Marseille, at the back of Marseille. And these were sort of deserted, faraway places, and you could only get to them by walking to them. And so he put his foot on these various places, and then allowed Jewish, primarily Dutch Jews, as I understand it, but also other Jewish people to stay in those houses. And he did that for quite some time. In fact, he started that in mid-1943, and he kept going right through to liberation in 1944. And he and my father used to, on a Sunday, they would get in the tram, they'd go as far as the tram went to the terminus, and then they would walk. They'd take food and they'd walk to these various places, and that sometimes was like a 5-hour walk to get to them, and they'd distribute the food and then they'd come home. But at some point, a person from one of those farmhouses went into a village looking to buy sweets, would you believe, and was then, it was reported because he was speaking in a foreign accent, and people thought he was a German, a German...
a spy or...
no, a deserter.
A deserter, uh-huh.
And so that led to my grandfather being taken into the prefecture and questioned, and the fellow that was there said, well, you know, we know that you're hiding Jews, and if you don't tell us the locations of where they all are, who they are, we don't get a list by tomorrow, then your family will all be in a concentration camp by tomorrow night. And so my grandfather then went home, spoke to my grandmother, and they decided that they would send away their children. And so my father then was 15 going on 16, and his younger brother Philippe was about 12, and his youngest brother Dudu was about 4 years of age. And so they put them all on a train that night, and they'd made an arrangement, and they were to get on the train and go to Limoges, which is in southwest France. my father was given the instructions, you must stay awake, don't fall asleep, so that you don't want to miss the station. And so they went off into the night, as it were, and they were met at this train station by a person who was, in fact, the son of a Jewish guy that my grandfather had helped. And they took them in for a number of days into their home in Limoges, and then they were secreted or taken away to a place called Conflans, which is in the southwest of France.
And what about your grandparents? Did they then have to provide the details of where they were hiding Jewish people?
You know, I don't know the history of that. I do know that guy never reported my grandfather. And why, I'm not sure, but he didn't.
And then your dad and his two younger brothers are far away from their family, another part of France. What happened to your dad then?
Well, they were. My father was kept at an inn called La Belle Étoile in Conflans, and that inn was run by a lady whose name I think was Madame Fumeron, and Madame Fumeron had a number of people hidden there, including a professor of mathematics from the Sorbonne who lived in the ceiling. And she and her sons would look after these people. My father's brother, Philippe, was sent to another village called Ansac, which is not very far from there, and Dudu, the little fellow, was at another house in Conflans, and they basically led semi-normal lives. My father went to school, although he wasn't enrolled in the school, but the head teacher said he would let him come to classes. He wasn't to use his surname and wasn't to tell people too much about himself. During 1943, in July 43, I think it was, the Vichy government made a piece of legislation which was called La Relève, I think. But what it was an agreement with the Germans that they would now send young French men to France to work in the factories to free up Germans for the front. And so suddenly the young fellows were being rounded up in this area of Conflans and throughout France. And my father by then had turned 16 years of age, and so he was at risk of moving around in the community at all, and so he ended up joining the Maquis, which is like the French underground, but they were like guerrilla fighters for the resistance.
At just 16, was he actually
16.
involved in fighting? Yes,
he was. Yeah, he was significantly involved in fighting in France. Later, some time later, he ended up joining the Dutch army and fought against the Japanese in the Pacific. But when he joined the Dutch army, he couldn't speak Dutch, but he was immediately made a squad leader because he was a combat veteran. And there were not many combat veterans there because they were all just young fellas, and he was only 17 and was already a combat veteran.
How did he end up in Australia during the war?
When the Allies landed in D-Day on 6th of June, 1944, they landed in Normandy. In the days that followed, they also landed at a place called Cavalaire near Saint-Tropez. And by that time, the Germans were on the retreat by then. My father then said he wanted to join an army, and it was to be the Dutch army because he had Dutch nationality. And so he was smuggled through the lines down to Marseille, thinking he'd be joining the Dutch army, but then he discovered that there was no Dutch army. The Dutch hadn't landed at Cavalaire. And so he then was sent by the Allies to London, where he joined the Dutch army, and then he was sent out by the Dutch army to the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch were fighting in New Guinea and the Pacific. That boat landed in a place which he'd never heard of called Brisbane, and that was his first contact with Australia. And then he was sent by the Dutch army to the jungle training course at Canungra, which is at the back of the Gold Coast, where a lot of troops were trained, or most troops were trained during those days for jungle training.
So where was he when the war ended, Chris?
He was in the Pacific. He was even after the war ended, they were doing a lot of liberating of places where there were still Japanese troops, and often there was fighting against those Japanese troops after the war ended, because a lot of them didn't know the war had ended, a lot of the Japanese, and some of them had a kind of an attitude they were going to carry it on anyway. But so ultimately he was demobbed from what was known as the Dutch East Indies, and then he went back to Marseille.
And then what job did his dad, your granddad, arrange for him at the end of the war?
Yeah, well, when my dad got back to France, I think he was a bit like a lot of veterans. At that time, he was at a bit of a loose end, and my grandfather organised for him to get a job with the Rotterdam Zoo, collecting Australian native animals, birds and animals. And so he went back out to Australia, and he then he was running around trapping kangaroos and all those sort of things.
So he was actually doing the trapping himself and catching them.
Yeah, he was doing all of that. Yeah,
and then
boxing them up
and then travelling with these poor native Australian animals all the way to the Netherlands.
They just put them in crates and they'd put them on a boat and they'd take them back. And that of course was, I don't know, it was a journey of weeks to get back by sea.
That would have been quite a noisy, smelly boat, I'm imagining, by the time it finally landed in Rotterdam.
And that's to say nothing of the animals, yeah.
Who was he sharing that boat with?
All sorts of people. He used to tell a terrific tale about a guy some Australian guy who I think was a bit of a drunk, but this guy somehow got a contract to supply the Ethiopian army with horses because they were going to start a cavalry in Ethiopia for Haile Selassie. And this fellow sort of, instead of sort of getting first-class horses, he went out west, I think, and rounded up a whole lot of brumbies that were as wild as one thing and put them all in crates. And my father had crates there with the kangaroos on them, and they were all being shipped off. They got as far as Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and the guy, the drunk, sort of disappeared, and they were trying to unload these horses onto the quay in Addis Ababa, and it was the Ethiopian army that were doing this. And of course, all these guys, these Ethiopian guys, had never seen a horse, I guess. If they had, they didn't know how to handle horses, and they were trying to get the horses off the ship. They just had a long gangplank, and they'd have the horse at the top of the gangplank, and they had a big long rope, and there'd be about 5 or 6 guys at the bottom pulling that rope, trying to get the horse down. And of course, the horse in those circumstances isn't going to go anywhere. And my father, it was just, a kid, but had by then been in the army, had been a leader of men in the army and so forth. He sort of stepped up and said, "No, that's not the way to do it. I can show you how." And he took his shirt off and he put his shirt over the horse's head, and of course then he just led the horse down. The horse went, because it couldn't see anything, it went straight down. And these people were amazed, and they were all then starting to talk about how he needed to head up the Ethiopian cavalry, and there was some talk about him going to see Haile Selassie to talk to him about that, but luckily he didn't go that way. He kept going.
Well, apart from shipping kangaroos and wild horses from Australia to Rotterdam, what other work was he doing out west in Queensland as a young bloke?
I think a bit of everything, but, mainly building picture theatres and that sort of stuff. And there was a lot of money in the West, as I said, in those days. And, there were things to be built, sharing sheds and all that sort of stuff. And so he, spent some years out there doing all of that. Of course, he'd moved through the West with his work with the animals and all that sort of stuff. And so, that whole period became a real kind of feature of Nyst family folklore, because we grew up with those stories and those sentiments, and not least of all because it wasn't just my father that ended up there. Obviously, my mum was there and tagging along and living in shearers' sheds and all that sort of stuff as when we were born and brought up. But his brothers also came out from France at different times and did some of all of that with him. And Dudu, who was the youngest, ended up living in Mitchell for quite some time.
You went back with your dad to visit his family in France over the years. What did you make of your grandparents when you met them? Because I guess you'd heard all these stories about your grandfather's and your grandmother's heroic actions during the war. What were they like to meet?
My grandfather was a bit of a cruiser. He was sort of one of those guys that would sit around and pontificate and like to read books and all that sort of stuff, and was a thinker, I guess. And I remember one of my abiding memories of him is him sitting out at La Bretagne, which was a rest home that my grandmother ran, and he'd sit out there, he'd find a place in the sun, and Dudu had bought him a big Stetson hat, and he used to wear the Stetson hat, and he'd put his hands on top of his walking stick, and he had a little piece of, like a handkerchief or a rag he'd put on the top hand so he wouldn't get sunburned in the sun, so his hand wouldn't get sunburned. And he'd just sit there for hours speaking to people and pontificating generally. So he was a pretty cruisy sort of guy. Ranier was his name. But my grandmother was almost the opposite. She was, like my dad, a real force of nature. She was the great matriarch. And she established this nursing home. Was called La Bretagne. She established that. And in fact, she did it because at that time, and still now, the world headquarters of the French Foreign Legion was in Aubagne, which is just outside Marseille. And La Bretagne was an old building on an acreage near Aubagne. And so she established that as a nursing home, and it was a nursing home specifically for retired officers from the French Foreign Legion. And that went on for many, many years and remained in the family. We're just in the process of selling it now, but it's still
So
in the
when
family.
you'd go and visit, did you meet any of those retired French Foreign Legion officers?
Oh, yeah, lots of them.
What
yeah,
were they
yeah.
like?
Oh, well, they were like retired people. They were like old. And also a lot of the staff were ex-legionnaires. And there were some interesting guys. There was one guy in particular, Zorro, who we used to see a lot. Zorro was what they called him, I don't know. But Zorro was sort of like a hardy, tough sort of guy, and he was always there to do all the work, and he'd do basically everything, but not just at La Bretagne. He'd also, my father had a boat over there in the Lec Harbour, and an old sailing boat. And, if we had to go and clean the barnacles off the boat or whatever, Zorro would always be there. And there were others as well. But Zorro was the one I remembered because of the name, Zorro. That was pretty exciting.
Well, given all of the things that your dad had lived through at such a young age, I mean, was he pretty tough on you and your brothers?
Tough. I mean, I don't know. Not really. No, my father was. He was. I suppose tough in this sense. We were his slaves, as sons tended to be to their fathers in those days.
In my book, we were his slaves.
Whenever something had to be done, it was, come on, boys, let's get together. If we all get together, it won't take long if we all get into it. Used to be Eddie's saying, it won't take long if we all get into it. So, which meant he would tell us what to do and we'd do the labouring sort of thing. But no, he was a doer, Eddie. A complete opposite to me. I'm a guy that'll sit on the couch 3 weeks as long as the football keeps playing. But he was a doer, and he always was moving mountains, basically. And,
You mentioned that after having a range of different careers and doing a lot of building and kind of building up family business here in Queensland, he went back and studied law.
He did.
Who else was studying law with him at the same time?
Well, I know one bloke. He started law with me when I started law at Queensland University. My dad started at the same time.
So what, you were 18 or so?
Yeah, I was 17. I was 17 years old. My father had been successful in business, and he retired when I think he was 40 or 42, something like that. I guess he just sort of thought, here's my opportunity. My son's going to start law. I'll go and start with him. So
how did you feel about that?
That didn't worry me at all. He did his own thing. He kept out of my way. I used to sit up the back of the class and throw spitballs, metaphorically speaking. But he was always in the front row and very conscientious, as older students tend to be. But yeah.
So did you graduate together?
No, we went through. He ended up, as I said, going to the bar. I ended up following the solicitor's course, and so we went our own separate ways in that sense. I, during those years, got very diverted into surfing, and that was something that took me away a lot.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konofsky.
So, Chris, after you'd graduated, after studying at the same time as your dad, studying law together at the University of Queensland, what made you want to start your career at the Gold Coast?
By then I was hooked on surfing, and it's in a way it's kind of hard to explain to people, but surfing became all-consuming to me, and I think to a whole generation of young guys in particular. And so I was just keen to get to the surf and be near the surf. So that was the short answer to that.
And what kind of reaction did your mum have to the idea of you setting up not in chambers in Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne, but at the Goldie?
Well, my mum went to see her solicitor and asked what he thought of that, and he said, no, don't let him go to the Gold Coast. That's a legal backwater, and lawyers on the Gold Coast were just wore shorts and long socks, Bermuda shorts and long socks, and did conveyancing, and that was it basically. And so I actually took heed of that initially. I started my articles in Brisbane, but I was always keen to get to the Gold Coast, and I ended up coming down to the coast.
You're wearing a very dapper suit today, but did you ever wear Bermuda shorts and long socks in your early days as a lawyer?
I can honestly say I have never worn a pair of Bermuda shorts, and certainly not long socks to work, that's for sure, yeah.
Well, in those early years, in the late 70s at the Gold Coast, what kind of cases made up the majority of your work? When
I first came to the Gold Coast, I came, I think, to work full-time in 75. And, I was just a young lawyer learning my trade, but I fell quite quickly into the crime genre, if I can use a literary film term. But I fell quite quickly into that and started doing a lot of that. By the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of the work I was doing was drug work, and specifically heroin-related, because heroin went through the Gold Coast and particularly the surfing community, not just the Gold Coast surfing community, but I think the surfing community worldwide. Heroin went through that population like a dose of salts, as it were. And there was a lot of that sort of work, and I was, drawn into it, I suppose, because, I knew that world, that surfing world in particular. And so, I was doing an awful lot of that by the early 80s.
In these years before the Fitzgerald Inquiry in Queensland, what kind of issues did clients have in terms of the way they were being treated by police in those days?
Pre-Fitzgerald Inquiry, criminal law, it was like the Wild West. It was crazy. The police, however people might like to rewrite history now, the police were misbehaving badly, and it wasn't just about corruption, money changing hands, that sort of thing, but the use of or what became known as the verbal. In Queensland, it was very, very widespread in my experience and in the experience of every other lawyer I know that lived through it.
What is a verbal?
A verbal is just simply the making up or the fabrication of a verbal confession. So, for example, if I decide to charge Sarah with stealing a box of chocolates, then I say to her, I get her into the police station and say, okay, well, now do you admit that you stole this box of chocolates? She says, no, it wasn't me. I say, okay. And then I sit down and I write in my notebook, question, Sarah, did you steal these chocolates? Answer, yes, I did, but you can't prove it. Question, where did you steal them from? Answer, I'm not telling you where I stole them from, but I stole them and that's all, and I'm not saying anything more. Now that confession, if you like, was able to be given without any signature or initials or anything else,
just
given in a court of law. Complete fabrication.
And were there no recordings of police interviews
in those
back then?
days? There were no recordings. Now all interviews in relation to indictable offences must be tape recorded, but at that time there was no such thing. And those verbals, if you like, were used in cases all the way from stealing a box of chocolates up to mass murder. Sometimes they may have been true. These things may have been said, but sometimes they perhaps weren't.
So what are some of the bigger cases that it's been revealed they were false confessions?
This went through to all cases. Even the biggest criminal case in Queensland history, I think still, being the Whiskey A Go-Go firebombing case. In that case, a verbal confession, when I say verbal, an unsigned record of interview was a part of, and the most significant part of, the evidence against one of the accused in that. So it wasn't just being used for minor petty stuff. And there was evidence, I know, given at the Lucas Royal Commission by a very experienced criminal law solicitor that up to 80% of his cases involved allegations of verballing. And so the truth was that as a young lawyer, as I was coming through doing my thing, for about the first decade and more of my 15 years probably of my practicing career, we spent all our time in courts arguing about what was and wasn't said behind closed doors in police stations.
How would you go about arguing on behalf of a client when there's no record? There's just a policeman's word against accused.
Well, you had to work at it. And, some were better than others, but it was an uphill battle. And sometimes you did win because juries are good at discerning the truth from things, but very often you didn't. And it became a real cause célèbre, as it were. It became something that really consumed me, and I know other lawyers that were in those trenches at that time. I mean, people like Terry O'Gorman, who's well known, I think, to listeners. Terry lived through that era with us as well, and his partner John Robertson, and so many other good lawyers who really worked very hard every day in the courts fighting that process.
What was your opinion of how that culture developed in the Queensland Police? How had that grown up as part of the police force?
It's I think there's no doubt that it sort of started with a view that was taken, or at least foisted on people, that the smarties were getting away with things and we can't catch them. We know they've done it. We can't prosecute them. We should be, there must be another way. And I think a lot of people that went into the police, I think most people that go into the police force and did at that time started off with a view to trying to do the right thing. And I learnt about this in the aftermath of the Fitzgerald Inquiry. I was acting for a quite senior officer who in the licensing branch, who was ultimately prosecuted for perjury at the Fitzgerald Inquiry Commission. In acting for him, I had to go back through, obviously, as you do with all of these cases, and talk about his background and how it all started and where all this came from and so forth. And the story he told, I think, is probably a typical story. He came from reasonably humble circumstances. He went into the police force wanting to make a difference, wanting to do good things. He found himself amongst older officers who were jaded and not, I guess, willing to do the hard yards. He was taught about verballing and some other practices, but just focusing for now on verballing. And he was convinced by others that this was the right way to do the right thing, and he adopted it. And I often think when I heard that story and I extrapolated out over the rest of this man's career, I feel like once you cross that line as a police officer or as anybody, as a lawyer or whatever, once you cross that line where you think, look, it's okay to break the rules and do the wrong thing if it's for the right reasons, then you are lost in the long run because, you do these things for the right reason and then eventually you say, well, I may as well make a quid while I'm doing it. And so, as I said, to answer your question, I think it was something that happened by degrees to good people.
Is that part of what you're often doing as a criminal lawyer, Chris, starting with the crime at hand and working back to try to understand, I guess, the life story of that person who's sitting in front of you?
Always, because that's why I invariably start my first conference with everybody is I want you to sit down and I want you to write out a life history. Just tell me about yourself so I know who you are and where you came from and what influenced you and what made you happy, what made you sad, and how did you end up here, sort of thing. Because I think that's what you've got to do. How
willing are people to do that, to disclose to you some things that maybe they think are not going to be beneficial to them?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking about this to my youngest son, Jonathan, who is in practice with me as a criminal lawyer, and he was saying to me, he said, it's crazy, these people, we come into their lives and they tell us all this stuff and often it's stuff they've never told anybody before, but they tell us about themselves and all the rest of it. And he said, it's a real privilege being able to do that. And he said, we're only in their lives for a relatively short time, but we get to know these things and it's exactly how I feel about it. I think it's a great honour and a privilege, and it's one that you've got to be careful about because people are entrusting you with things that they may have never shared with anyone before and may never share again.
And you're encountering them presumably in some of the most difficult times of their whole life.
You are. They are at a low. They're in a crisis situation, and that again is a real privilege to be sort of. Basically, you're being called upon to stand beside somebody who doesn't have any friends, and be their friend, and not their friend, but be their ally, as it were.
Back in those pre-Fitzgerald days, Chris, you would have seen the things that were terribly wrong and damaging and immoral about the way the legal system was working. Was there also a part of you that enjoyed the adrenaline of it or liked the drama of it? Was it an exciting time to be a criminal lawyer?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, that was a big part of what carried me through those years. I just loved doing it. It was just great. It was exciting for a young man. I still think it's exciting, to be honest with you, criminal law. But in those days, it was particularly robust and exciting and sometimes a little bit threatening and scary. But it was, it was certainly a young man's endeavour in those days.
Were some of the detectives pretty tough characters or guys that you... I mean, what kind of encounters did you have with some of the police?
Look, there were a lot of tough old birds in those days, and some of them were quite serious. Some of them were serious people, not many, but some of them were. And so you had to be able to soak all of that up. I know that, I've been in situations over the years, in late-night situations in police stations where I've felt quite threatened by, one or two. They were exceptions rather than the rule. But what was not an exception was there was almost a universal animosity by those detectives towards people like me because we were considered to be sort of on the side of the crooks and we were a roadblock, and so we were not well received. Sometimes that spilled over into more threatening behaviour, but rarely.
Did that shift with Fitzgerald? Does it feel like a different kind of landscape now?
Totally. We just couldn't believe it when these things started hitting the newspapers and and the police started lining up to tell tales about each other. It was after it had been 15 years, and really my only experience in the law from the time I started. The police were as thick could be, and they stood shoulder to shoulder, and at least on what I was being told, would line up to tell lies consistent with each other. But they were very tight. And then suddenly Fitzgerald came along and they were all revealing all these things, and perhaps it was cathartic for a lot of them, and perhaps it was something that they had to do eventually. But they did, and it changed everything. And I remember after the Fitzgerald Inquiry finished, in the years that followed, it was a very busy time for us as lawyers, and particularly at the end of the Fitzgerald Inquiry, of course, all the prosecutions were going on, and so we were very busy doing those things. But I remember running into a fellow solicitor, John Robertson, who was Terry O'Gorman's partner for many years, and John is a lovely fellow, and John had been practising criminal lawyer for many years. He later became a district court judge. But John and I started talking, there must have been probably a year or two after the inquiry had finished, and we just started talking about, things have changed and da-da-da-da-da, and we got talking about how much better the police force were at their jobs now and what a much better job they were doing and how good it was with all of the interviews being tape recorded and so forth. And we would have been there, this was just in Turbot Street, we just ran into each other on the footpath, and I think we would have been there about an hour just chatting away about this. And as we were leaving, John said to me, or I said to him, it's not as much fun anymore, is it? Which was kind of the way it was. So suddenly, we were dealing with a whole different animal.
Better for the public, not as much fun for the lawyers.
That's it.
There's a portrait of you in your Gold Coast office painted by a client currently in prison. Tell me about that.
That was painted by Brenden Abbott, who became known as the postcard bandit. And Brenden was jailed for a long, long time. He's still in prison. I think he's not released for several years to come. But Brenden was a guy who'd escaped from the Fremantle jail as a young man, and although most escapees are recaptured within a week or two at most of their escape, he was on the run for 6 years. And during that time, of course, as a criminal on the run, he committed crime, as in bank robberies. And so when he was finally caught, he ended up doing a long stretch. Anyway, to answer your question, when he went to prison, he spent a long time in solitary confinement. In fact, an inordinate time in solitary confinement. I think close to a decade in solitary confinement, broken by another escape. But that's another story. But he then took up painting, and he was a very, very accomplished painter, an excellent painter, and he painted my portrait when he was in Sado Longlands Centre.
The kind of treatment or the way that his incarceration has involved those long periods of solitary confinement, as a lawyer, how do you make sense of that? How does it compare to the way other people convicted of similar crimes might be treated once they're in prison? There was a hysteria about Abbott because he had escaped, firstly, from Fremantle prison, the only prisoner I think that ever escaped and never went back to Fremantle because Fremantle closed down, I think, in the early 90s. But he'd escaped, and then he'd been on the run for so long, and the police it was just driving them crazy that they couldn't get him. And that became a real issue, not only with police but with corrective services authorities and government generally. And so there was a great deal of hysteria about him, and that hysteria that manifested itself when he was taken into custody in Queensland. The Queensland authorities were absolutely determined that he'd never escape, and so they just gave him these stints of solitary confinement. They give him 6 months at a time. Now, solitary confinement used to be a thing in the old days at Bogger Road. They used to call it the Black Hole, and eventually there was much controversy about the Black Hole during the Fitzgerald years and so forth. And Bogger Road was essentially closed down
because of those sort of controversies about the black hole and solitary confinement. But I've never known of anybody to have been in the black hole for more than about 3 weeks. Abbott was in solitary confinement for about 10 years. He did 3 years, then he escaped again from Woodford. At the time, he was a bit of a political football because the state government was saying how we're tough on crime, and the opposition was saying, oh no, we're tougher on crime. All of this happened in the lead up to a Queensland state election, and in that election, the actual ads in the election were, or at least one of the ads had a picture of Brenden Abbott saying this will never happen, they'll never escape, he'll never escape from us. And so they devised ultimately a thing that they called euphemistically the Supermax solution, and that was just throw people away, lock people away and throw away the key. And he ended up being a part of that regime. All I'm saying is I think things got a bit crazy, things got a bit out of control, and they're probably still so now. Abbott should have been out, in my view, in my humble view, should have been out a long time ago, but nobody wants to let him out because nobody wants to be the one that's responsible for it.
As I mentioned, you, as well as your work as a criminal lawyer, you write crime fiction, you write screenplays and films, and these stories often feature elements of cases that you've been involved in. Do the stories ever cut a bit close to the bone for some of the clients? Have you ever had any criticisms or questions after you've published something as fiction from someone you've represented?
I write fiction. I think all.
So what you tell them late at night? It's all fiction.
Well, that's what but it's true. I don't write fact. My writing is a diversion for me. I would not be interested in. I've been offered gigs to do and good money to write some things about real life crime, but it just doesn't interest me. I write fiction because, as I said, I think all good fiction is based in fact. All of my stories are based around my experiences and so forth with people and factually and so forth. Because of that, because of the way I write, people tend to recognise particularly characters in my books. So, for example, when I wrote my first book, Cop This, which was about the wild events of pre-Fitzgerald Inquiry, Queensland, I wrote a lot about crooks and cops and so on and so forth, and lawyers. And after Cop This came out, I was constantly being besieged by people, mostly retired or still active police officers, saying, oh, I see you were writing about Merv so-and-so, and oh, I see that bloke, I know who he is. And half the time I'd be saying, oh, yeah, but I had no idea who they were talking about. But they were just, I think, recognising in that book, recognising character types, etc., which was quite gratifying because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to capture the character types and events.
In the decades that you've been working closely with criminals, guilty or innocent or otherwise, have you seen a change in the kind of criminals who you work with? Is there a cultural change?
Yeah, I think there is. I think, I perceive there to be. I think, if you go back to the 70s, I think most of the criminals were still basically products of Struggle Street. They were people that were just trying to make their way and do a bit better than they should have been doing. I think that's changed over the years. I mean, I guess the bikies are a great example. The bikies used to be basically bushies. They were just wild. I was going to say wild young men, but they weren't all young, but just wild people. Some of them were ex-vets and all that sort of stuff. But that seems to have changed the flavour of all of that. But, they were just real knockabout sort of bushies. Now there's a sort of a organised crime wash to them. Now, I think part of that wash is purposely imposed by authorities, but I think to some extent there is a truth in that. I think that goes across the board. There was a very, very strong sense of camaraderie and I'll call it an honour amongst thieves, which isn't quite correct, but a sense that you couldn't step outside of the rules, as it were. I think a lot of that's gone by the board. I think now people are much more in that world, much more looking after their own interests.
In your crime fiction, the lawyer is called Eddie. Is that a tribute to your dad?
You know, it's not really. It's actually, it's more of a lift. When I first wrote that character, I was thinking of Fast Eddie Felsen, who was the Paul Newman in The Hustler, was Fast Eddie Felsen, and this lawyer was to be a kind of fast-moving dude, so it just became Eddie.
But it still works as a tribute to your dad in my book.
It does, indeed, yes.
Chris, thank you so much for telling us a bit about your life and your family on Conversations.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
That was my conversation with lawyer, novelist, screenwriter and surfer Chris Nyst. This conversation was produced on the lands of the Yagara, Turrbal and Gadigal peoples. The producer was Nicola Harrison. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.